Good afternoon. I'm Barbara Eisenberg, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's session with journalist and author Jodi Kantor. Jodi Kantor is having the sort of career that other journalists only dream about. She dropped out of Harvard Law School in 1998 to start her journalism career with Slate.com. 4 years later, she moved to the New York Times as editor of the paper's Arts and Leisure section, and she was then 27 years old. A few years later, she headed back to writing for the New York Times, and particularly writing about politics. As a reporter, she moved from covering Barack Obama, the candidate, to covering Barack Obama, the president. Her many pieces on the president, and often the First Lady, led to a cover story in the New York Times Sunday magazine about the first couple's marriage, and soon after that, the offer of a book contract about them. In 2012 came her best-selling book, The Obamas, which the Telegraph newspaper called as tense, tight, and intimate a portrait of life in the White House as an episode of The West Wing. New Yorker editor David Remnick noted that Kantor nails her story. We political gluttons will lick the spoon clean. She took a break from the paper to finish her book, but when she returned, she wasted little time finding other terrific topics to write about. And today we're going to hear about her widely discussed articles on the controversial personnel policies of giant corporations, Starbucks and Amazon. In August 2014, Jodi Kantor was on the front page of the Times with the harrowing tale of how unpredictable scheduling practices affected Starbucks employees. And in August 2015, she was back with another distressing tale, this time a 5,400-word expose about how Amazon's growing ambitions created a very stressful workplace for its employees. So please join me now in welcoming to the stage Jodi Kantor.
Thank you so much for having me here and coming to hear me speak. I want to start by getting a little sense of the room. Can you please raise your hand if you have bought something from Amazon in the last month? Okay. Who here has had a Starbucks coffee in the last month? Okay, great. Who here is still working? Okay, great. Keep your hand up if you are not working for yourself, but if you work for a big company. Okay, only a few people. How many people here have had, at some point in their life, an hourly job? Okay, I did too. I worked for a paint store, not arty paint, more like contractor paint in the summer after high school. Raise your hand if you're a New York Times reader. All right, a New York Times reader. Okay, great, our people. So what I'd like to do in the next 50 minutes is really bring you into the story behind the story, talk about two big pieces I did for the paper, the impact they had, why we did them, how we worked very carefully to put them together, and the impact they had. And what the stories have, can everyone hear me? Okay, good. What the stories have in common is that they're both about the workplace, and they're both about workplaces that seemed almost unrecognizable because the workplace is changing so fast, especially due to technology. I found in my reporting that a lot of the ideas that we were brought up with or that we held for most of our working lives about employers and employees, and specifically how much our employers can ask of us, have changed really rapidly. And so even though these two stories were very different, that is what they had in common. So I'm going to try to talk for about half an hour, and then hopefully we can have a discussion for the last 15 minutes. So the first story was about Starbucks, but it wasn't really supposed to be about Starbucks when I started. I was reporting a lot about gender about 2 or 3 years ago, and I was looking at gender in the workplace, but I was trying, frankly, not to write the same stories that we've heard again and again about gender, because in a way, gender patterns are so stubborn and so set into society that they have a predictable kind of arc sometime. And I was looking to break new ground and see what else we could report that was less understood. So I started looking at the work world and work schedules. And what I learned about low-income jobs is that hourly jobs work very differently now than they used to until just about a few years ago. It used to be that if you ran a store or a cafe or a fast food outlet, you made the schedule in a very simple way, right? Many of us worked these jobs growing up. On Sunday morning or Monday morning, the manager would take a blank piece of paper labeled Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, etc. Slot different workers in for, a 5-hour shift, a 6-hour shift, the dinner shift, the late shift, the early shift, maybe do a little shuffling around by hand depending on people's availability. And often, by the way, that schedule was very stable, and the same people worked the same shifts from week to week to week to week. How many people here have worked in that kind of pattern sometime in life? I work the Wednesday afternoon shift, I work the Saturday morning shift, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So along came a piece of software that changed all of that. And part of what fascinated me about the story is that I didn't go into it even thinking I was really writing about technology, but I realized that I was, and that it wasn't a tech story about a hot startup or about Facebook or a company like that. It was about a piece of kind of software infrastructure that was very little known, but was radically changing the lives of millions and millions of people. And that was this really unsexy thing called scheduling software. Now, from a business point of view, if you are running a corporation, scheduling software is amazing. It is revolutionary because what it does is that it takes this very sophisticated, algorithmic approach to scheduling, and it can move workers around in this very intricate ballet that gets workers exactly where you need them, when they need them. So for example, if you're running a chain of big box stores, your scheduling software can match up with your delivery software. And the second you have a bunch of big trucks unloading inventory in a delivery bay, workers can be there as if by magic to appear and to unload the trucks. The way that works is that the worker would get, a little ping on his or her phone a couple of days ahead of time saying this truck is going to materialize at this time. They come, they do a 3-hour shift, they unload the truck, they leave. The software can also do things like look at the weather. There's going to be a big blizzard back east in the next few days. This software can say, business is going to be heavier than usual because this blizzard is coming, or it's going to be lighter than usual. More workers can be called in, more workers can stay home, et cetera, et cetera. The level of efficiency, the cost savings, the kind of synchronicity you can get from that sort of software is revolutionary for businesses. I mean, essentially what it's letting them do is that they're controlling the cost of labor in a much more precise way. Now, if you're a worker, what is the effect of that on your life? It means that you are finding out your schedule sometimes just hours in advance, often 2 to 3 days in advance. It means your shift can be canceled at the last minute. It means that sometimes even you can show up to work, and if things are slow, they'll send you home. It means the manager is checking sales. Sometimes when you're in a retail store in the mall, you don't know that this is happening, but the manager every hour is speaking into a headset that is telling workers, like, this is how many dollars we took in today, this is whether we're on target, et cetera, et cetera. And if the store is not doing well enough, a couple of people will be sent home that day. Not dismissed from their jobs, just sent home to not work the rest of the day so the store can save money. So think about trying to run your life if you are a worker and you've got that kind of schedule. Think about if you have young children, how you line up babysitting when you have that little notice, how you make a parent-teacher conference appointment, how you make a doctor's appointment, how you arrange transportation, et cetera, et cetera. So I was learning about these things in the abstract, and I realized that there was essentially a revolution in the work world that was not being written about that much. But what I really wanted to do was show how it played out in somebody's life. Because as a reporter, I could imagine that this was having huge consequences for people, but I wanted to find a way to tell the story that was really compelling. So I spent a couple of weeks just talking to low-income workers. I grew up in the Jersey exurbs, and so one day I drove out to New Jersey and I kind of walked the malls of my 1980s New Jersey childhood and talked to workers, and it was startling how much those workplaces had changed. I walked around New York City, I networked online, and I found hourly workers all over the country. And what basically they told me is that every one of these workers had some sort of story about scheduling and the drama it was creating in their lives. So then I got to, so one of the ways I reported the story is that I contacted a bunch of daycare centers because I thought to myself, well, if workers are, working literally different hours every day, every week, every month, what is it doing to these daycare centers? How do they even know how many kids they're getting at any particular time or how much income they can rely on or whatever? So I started talking to daycare centers, and yes, they said sure enough they were feeling the effects of this. And what I did is, which I often do as a reporter, is that I left my name and my number and I sent emails to managers of daycare centers because they often will not give you somebody's name without asking them first. But what they are willing to do is forward an email from a reporter and say, well, is anybody feeling this willing to talk to this reporter, et cetera, et cetera. So I was driving upstate for 4th of July weekend, 2014, and I got a message saying, call this woman, Jeanette Navarro, she works at Starbucks. And I thought, Starbucks, they're supposed to be such a great employer. They've got all these progressive policies. Everybody knows that Starbucks is a better place to work than McDonald's or Burger King. Is she really going to be the right person, et cetera, et cetera. So I called her, and as soon as the conversation was over, I booked a flight to San Diego to meet her on Monday, because what I understood a tiny bit on the phone and then understood much better once I arrived in San Diego is that the forces of this scheduling software were, in a sense, pulling apart Jeanette Navarro's life. She was a young single mother, Latina, early 20s, adorable son, still in a kind of daycare-like preschool, not a lot of family resources. Her mom had died when she was young. Her father was absent. She was depending on an uncle and aunt for help. And working at Starbucks for Jeanette was really aspirational. It was by far the nicest place she had ever worked. She loved Starbucks. She loved making the coffee. She loved what Starbucks represented. But she found that the constantly changing hours were seesawing her in a way that she basically could not keep up with. And interestingly, they were impacting not just her, but the people all around her and the people she depended on for support. She was getting her schedule, really not much in advance, a couple of days at best, and sometimes not even that. So scheduling, and I should also say that when you're the economy has improved somewhat since the story ran, and unemployment is down, but especially when unemployment was a little higher, companies would keep vast pools of workers kind of on call and bring them into work when they could work, but they were very underemployed, and there was this constant scramble to get enough hours. And when you're working a minimum wage job, getting enough hours is critical. So Jeanette was always at the mercy of Starbucks. She did have a manager who looked over the schedules before they went out, but essentially this algorithm was determining, you need to be here at 4 o'clock in the morning, on one day, or 10 o'clock at night, on another day, and keeping up with it without a lot of money, without a partner, was causing her enormous distress. She often had to do something called clopening. Does anybody know what clopening is? So you can hear the words closing and opening. Clopening among retail and restaurant workers is what they call it when you have to close late one night and then open early the next morning. And as you know, Starbucks is open pretty late and it opens pretty early. So Jeanette would work until very, very late at night. She didn't have a car, so she would, take public transportation home or try to sleep somewhere closer to the stores. She would get a couple hours of sleep barely, and then go back to work again. She would sometimes take a nap on the sidewalk before the store opened because she was so tired. So I had, I was in San Diego literally watching Jeanette's hard-forged life kind of come apart at the seams because of the software. I basically watched her boyfriend break up with her, in part because he just couldn't keep up with a constantly changing schedule, watching her fight with her aunt and her uncle because there was so much tension over who would take care of their young son. They were really trying to help, but found her changing schedule very difficult to keep up with. And I came back to New York. I remember that plane ride home, and I just remember this visceral feeling of I can't believe what's happening, and I can't believe what we don't know as consumers, right? We think we know Starbucks. That place is so familiar to all of us, and yet the baristas do have a kind of manufactured cheerfulness that they are told to practice, like the cute thing with, the way they write your name on the cups or whatever. And even though Starbucks is in some respects a better employer than some of its competitors, it is still a minimum wage employer using this very advanced computer software to move people around. So it took a week or two to sort out the best way to tell the story. I wanted people to feel both in Jeanette's life very directly, and yet I wanted readers to understand the larger context of what was going on with the software, and the fact that it was so omnipresent that you could really walk into, any chain store at any strip mall and the same thing would be happening. So we published the story, and it went online at 9:30 or 10 p.m. East Coast time. And the next morning, I was taking the subway to work, and I got basically a shocking call from a Starbucks PR person who said that they were changing their policies in response to the story. Now, just to be clear, I had communicated a lot with Starbucks before publication. We really didn't want to surprise them with what they were reporting. And also, to be honest, I kind of had to check Jeanette out, right? Because I had to make sure that the story I thought I was reporting, which was of a very sincere, hardworking employee really not able to keep up with the system, was right. I mean, what if they told me, Jeanette has been, suspended, for doing something horrible on the job? The story wouldn't hold the same water. So I had been in contact with this guy, and he called me as I was about to go underground to take the subway, saying, we're changing our policies for all of our baristas nationwide. Starbucks has about 110 baristas whose schedules it controls directly. And I was speechless. My husband, Ron Lieber, who's also speaking at the festival, was with me, and we just looked at each other saying, this never happens. Because often when you are reporting on corporations, the paid flacks they're paid the big bucks to respond in a really defensive way to your story, right? I was sure that they were going to tell me that Jeanette was an isolated case, even though I had reported it out and proved that wasn't so. Or that she had failed to ask for more stable hours, or I was sure they were going to have some sort of excuse. But they were right, I think, to try to get ahead of the news, because the story did become a phenomenon among readers, I think in part because, again, Starbucks feels like something we know and understand, and this gave us sort of a whole new view of it. Now, there's sort of good news and bad news about the impact of that story. The bad news is that did Starbucks really rip up its scheduling software and say, our first priority is to give people really humane schedules that will allow them to take care of their families and fulfill their personal obligations? Of course not. They made a couple of changes to the schedule that were certainly improvements. The baristas I've talked to since then, let's just say that reports vary widely about how much the changes have really been put into effect. And Starbucks is in a competitive situation. In some ways, retailers are even more so. The retailers I talked to said, look, we are under so much pressure, given that many more people are shopping on the internet. Anything we can do to save money at our stores is at least keeping these people employed. The good news about the story is that it landed at the beginning of what really became a fight nationwide for better working schedules. You probably know about all of the action on the minimum wage front, that in the last couple of years, there have been big labor fights that have actually been pretty successful in raising the minimum wage. So the scheduling fight is, I think, considered a kind of successor to that. And there are a few cities around the country that have passed new scheduling laws. Around the country, there have been various companies, retailers that have announced that they're changing their scheduling policies, I think in some cases in a more substantive way than Starbucks did. And so what labor organizers told me after the story was published is that the story put a face to the problem. If you had said to people, it was a hard problem to explain, right? There's the software, there's this algorithm, here's how it works, et cetera, et cetera. And Jeanette, because she was such a sympathetic character and because we all know Starbucks so well, kind of put a face on that story. So I just talked to Jeanette a week or two ago because I like to check in with her every few months and see how she's doing. And you know, you often think that being the subject of a big story that gets tons of attention and generates lots of discussion would, you know, turn around your life or get you incredible help or something. That's only a little bit true. Readers were incredibly moved by Jeanette's story, and they did want to contribute money for her. So the New York Times doesn't accept money directly on behalf of the people we write about. To do so would present a lot of complicated ethical problems. But we found another way. There was a reader who was especially motivated, who wanted to organize a fund for Jeanette, so she did. Readers gave Jeanette a couple of thousands of dollars, and the good news is that Jeanette now has a car, so she's no longer, you know, waiting 45 minutes for public transportation in San Diego, but she is still really struggling. The other good news is that she did just get her first office job, and so she's moved on from Starbucks to a better job. I think what will ultimately happen with that job is a little bit unclear, but she is making she's making some progress. But I think things are still tough. The cost of housing in a city like San Diego alone is really formidable. So about 6 months after the Starbucks, I worked on other things. I'd worked on a story about Stanford and technology in Silicon Valley. And then at the beginning of 2015, I started work on a story about Amazon. So I want to ask you outright, how many people in the room read the Amazon story? Don't worry if you didn't. Okay, great, a lot. Normally I don't presume, but something like 5 or 6 million people read that story. So it's the one story I'm confident about, you know, asking, did you actually read it? We had no idea that was going to happen when we started working on the story. All we really knew was that we had heard interesting things about Amazon's culture. We had heard it was extremely demanding. We knew it was unbelievably successful. We had heard that they were, on the one hand, taking some elements of what other corporations had done to really get the best and most out of workers, but that they were combining these techniques in sort of interesting new ways. So what we did is we basically just started calling around to people who had worked at Amazon. We started more with people who had left, and then we moved on to current Amazon employees. And we really just asked them a simple question, which was, tell me about your time at Amazon. Tell me your experiences at Amazon. Now, I have to tell you as a reporter, sometimes you ask a question and people are like, what? They're like, I don't even get the premise of your story. Or they say, why are you even asking me that? Or they say, what are you even after anyway? That never happened one time with the Amazon story. Because working at Amazon, whether for people who loved it and for people who did not love it, working at Amazon is a very, very intense experience. And when I asked that question, I often felt like that was the only question I needed to ask. The longer I'm a journalist, the more of a minimalist I try to become. I actually try to get out of my own way in interviews and not talk. It's very hard not to talk that much in interviews, but I'm really trying to say less and less and less. And with the Amazon story, I had to say very little because I'd be on the phone long distance with somebody in Seattle, and it was almost like we were in a shrink's office or something. And they started to tell me their Amazon story. And in short, what I would say is that Amazon is only 20 years old, right? And what that company has accomplished in 20 years is really remarkable. They've changed the face of retail. They've changed the way we shop. They've played a huge invention and a huge role in the making of what we think of as the cloud, in coming up with web services. They're constantly entering different businesses. They're very open about the fact that their mission is really to conquer the world of retail. So when Amazon started, it had the intensity of a startup. But as it started to get bigger very quickly, Jeff Bezos and his top lieutenants really wanted to find a way to get the best out of, and the most out of every worker. They didn't want to go through the thing that many startups go through where, after that initial burst of inspiration and energy, you become slack, you become a big corporation, you become less motivated, you become more bureaucratic, et cetera, et cetera. So essentially, they invented this management system. Part of it is a set of what they call leadership principles, and part of it is a series of management tools that pretty much everybody at the company experiences that are designed to push you really, really hard. And they boast about it. They've boasted about it for years. They say this place is not for everybody. Very quickly, some of the elements of the management system are, there's a lot of anonymous feedback. There's like a little tool on your computer that allows you to either praise or criticize colleagues. The bosses know where it's coming from and who's sending it to who. But as a worker, you might get your performance evaluation and be told, well, this is what your colleagues have said about you, and you might not even know where it's coming from. Amazon lets go of a predetermined percentage of workers every year. They change the number from year to year based on their needs. But even though it's a very fast-growing company, even though they need a lot more workers, Bezos's view, the way he's described it, is that they want to be constantly raising the bar and constantly getting better and better people in. So they cut, some percentage, something like 6-7% of people every year, even if they're good. Even if they're good. So you could be, a perfectly well-respected employee. You could be contributing. And yet you're ranked against other members of your team. And if you don't make the cut, either for the right reasons or the wrong reasons, right? Because there are a lot of questions about whether the system is administered judiciously, you can find yourself out on the street. The intensity level at Amazon can be extraordinary. Obviously, it's a big, diverse company. And, lots of people like the stimulation. There are many people working at Amazon who told us that they responded really well to the intensity of the management system. Also, it's a big company, and not every corner of the company feels quite as pressured as some of them do. But it is not unusual to get emails very late at night. Workers told us about getting emails late at night saying, please respond by 8 a.m., and then getting follow-up texts from their bosses in the middle of the night saying, why haven't you responded to my email yet? There's an ongoing sense of competition. There's a sense that criticism is really valuable at the company. They pride themselves on critiquing one another's ideas in an unusually open and direct way. I think the idea is that it's kind of this running meritocracy and that the best ideas will win. But working there can feel very bruising because your colleagues are really picking apart what you're doing, and it's overlaid with this sort of constant competition. So we chronicled this in a story. We talked to about 100 Amazon workers, past and present. We talked about a former HR director calling this system human Darwinism. We talked about the reaction of other people in the industry who saw that a lot of people were leaving Amazon. And the story was published on a sleepy summer Saturday. I literally remember the moment it went online, and I thought, everybody's at the beach. Is anyone going to read the story? So I had never in my wildest dreams expected the kind of reaction we got. And the story caused an immense amount of debate. And I think part of why it did was because, like Starbucks, Amazon was so familiar to people, and yet we showed a new side of it. The stuff we showed was pretty secret. Businesses are really hard to report on. Big corporations are. More and more people have to sign NDAs when they go to work for a big company, meaning that you can be sued for even not giving away trade secrets, but even describing potentially your experiences. So as a reporter, these corporations are really tough to penetrate. And interestingly, the Amazon story caused a huge debate, especially in Silicon Valley, about whether these techniques were good or not. There were a whole bunch of famous venture capitalists and people like Jack Welch, the former CEO of GE, who said, right on, these techniques are what it takes to achieve greatness. And then there were other people who weighed in and said, no, this kind of work culture is corrosive, it's bad for people, it's actually bad for businesses. But what I'm glad about with that story is that the debate about Amazon had been kind of internal. If you lived in Seattle and if you knew the right people, then you had probably been to, lots of dinners where people were discussing Amazon's techniques. And the story made it a broader debate about the modern workplace. So I want to leave time for, we have about 10 minutes left. Okay, good. I want to leave lots of time for questions and discussions. You, sir, in the back.
What was your reaction to Bezos the next day?
So thank you for mentioning that. The question is, what was my reaction to Bezos the next day? So an extraordinary thing happened. Oh, and that reminds me to also talk a little bit about the impact of the story. The story was published on a Saturday morning. It basically caught fire over the weekend. On Monday, overnight, between Sunday and Monday, Jeff Bezos sent out a message to every Amazon employee. And the beginning of the message was, please read this New York Times story, and there was a link. And then please read this rebuttal by one Amazon employee who, disagreed with our take. And the rest of his message was, it was a little bit of a cipher. He did say things like, so probably the most egregious thing we described in the story is that we found a pattern of Amazon workers who were dismissed after they suffered some sort of life crisis. There were a number of women who had miscarriages, people who had cancer, people who had a dying parent. And what they said is, at Amazon, you have to give 110% all the time. And as soon as you go from 110% to simply giving a normal kind of work amount, you become less valuable. And because Amazon is constantly deciding which workers are going to be thrown overboard, if you have, a bad life event, something like a miscarriage that could leave you working shorter hours or leave you temporarily not feeling well, what these workers said is that Amazon did not give me time to recover. As soon as I had a problem, I was out. Probably the most heartbreaking story I heard was I talked to the mother of a stillborn child, and she lost this child unexpectedly, and she was just not given time to recover, she says, by the company. So Bezos, on the one hand, said, I don't recognize this company, these things are horrible. Obviously this is not who you want to be. Please contact me if that happens. I think my main response as a reporter was to have questions. We would have loved to interview Bezos for the story, and I would still, I'd still like to know, Bezos is very much the originator of this system, but did these practices crop up essentially far below him? And is he, sort of so removed from the front lines now that he doesn't know the way his ideas are being interpreted? Or was he really the enforcer of this system, and did he know exactly what was going on? And was his reaction to the story one of a kind of false innocence? And I should say also that a few weeks after the story was published, Amazon for the first time granted paid paternity leave, which it never had before, including to workers in its warehouses. So unlike with the Starbucks story, we can never say with certainty why Amazon did what it did, but other news publications have given us credit for that change happening. Okay, great. Am I right that we're out of time? Thank you so much.